Hello, everyone. I'm Jeremy Weber. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Law, and welcome. I'd like to acknowledge with respect the history, customs, and culture of Lekwungen-speaking peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands. Well, the first member of UVic's Faculty of Law was appointed in June 1974, and that first member was, any guesses? Yes, it's Diana Priestley. But these are two insiders who got the right answer. Who was, of course, the founder of our superb law library. The second was Murray Fraser, who was appointed on the 1st of July, 1974. And there then followed, over the course of fall 1974, Ron Cheffins, who is here in Victoria. He would dearly have loved to have joined us today. And he made up for his absence by sending all kinds of materials about the prehistory of the faculty, which of course he was intensely involved in because he had already been a member of the Department of Political Science and was very much involved in promoting the establishment of a Faculty of Law. So greetings from Ron Cheffins, also from Frank Borowitz, who also would have liked to have been here and sent along his apologies, along with also historical material. Neil Gold, who's running a workshop in Newfoundland. Lyman Robinson, who's in Arizona. And of course, the other people who were there were the late Terry Wooster, the late Bill Charles, who was a visiting professor from Dalhousie, and Keith Jobson, who is joining us today. The law school admitted its first class in September 1975, beginning the 40 years of legal education that we're celebrating today. Two members of that first class, Brian Day and Judge Gregory Rideout, are here today. And they'll be joined by 4 more members of that first class this evening. And of course, there are members of many other classes here. The first group of professors were then joined in 1976, the following year, by Jerry Ferguson, now distinguished professor at UVic, a linchpin of the faculty, anchor of our criminal law offerings, hugely productive researcher, innovator across the program, who's about to put on for the first time a course on the international control of corruption, which is tied to a UN-sponsored research project that he's engaged in. He's also an essential player in the governance of the faculty, to whom I'm continually grateful. Mary Ann Waldron also joined the faculty in that year. She, alas, can't be with us today, but she's still very much a member of the faculty, although now serving the central administration. In fact, she's leading the university's effort in the negotiation of the first collective agreement with the newly certified faculty union. The following year, Bill Neilson, who will be joining us as part of the panel in just a few minutes, was appointed. He, of course, came to UVic after teaching at Osgoode Hall and serving as Deputy Minister of Consumer Services here in BC, and of course was a transformational dean between 1985 and 1990. Donovan Waters, who's here with us today, also joined us in that year, as did Murray Rankin, who is of course the MP for Victoria, and he'll be joining us for dinner tonight. And in 1978, Hamar Foster, who is also here, was appointed the superb legal historian from whom we'll also be hearing as part of the panel. And I should also note 2 more of my predecessors who are here today. Is Maureen here?
No, she'll be tonight.
Maureen will be here tonight. Of course, the first woman to serve as dean of a law faculty in British Columbia, and the second in Canada. Also deputy minister to the Attorney General in the BC Public Service before returning to the faculty, and she's now a professor at SFU, and Andrew Petter, member of the class of 1981, dean from 2002 to 2008, now president and vice chancellor of SFU. And as you might have guessed from the fact that he's sitting up here, we'll be hearing from him in a few minutes. Now, I'm not going to take you through all of the years and all of the additions of faculty members, although I wish I were, because I see Sandra McCallum is also here. Welcome. One thing I will say about those years, and that is that the strength and stability of this faculty has truly been remarkable. Virtually everyone I've mentioned, and more, have left their mark upon this faculty. Many have remained for their entire careers. Their dedication and the sheer quality of their contributions have been an immense source of strength. Now today is an opportunity to reflect upon this school, its culture, and its contributions at various stages. The session will have two parts. In the first, three speakers, Anne Fraser, Andrew Petter, and Ron Skolrood, will give their reflections on the nature and contributions of the school. In the second, we'll have a panel of people from different stages in the faculty's history, and it will run as a kind of collective interview. Now, we were to have a professional conducting that interview. Laura Lynch, our own Laura Lynch, class of 1988, CBC journalist, but to her deep regret, Laura is covering the Essegair and Jazzer trial in Toronto and can't be here today, so I'm afraid you'll have to put up with me asking the questions. We'll then have time after the three speakers and after the panel. We'll then call the three speakers back up to the front with the panel so that we can have questions, comments, interventions from everyone here, because I know that you all have your own attachment to UVic Law. And indeed, I'm very pleased to see in the audience as well that Chancellor Emeritus Ron Lupoy and May Lupoy. Thanks very much for joining us. Now, our first speaker will be Anne Fraser. I'll keep the introduction short because our speakers, especially in this audience, genuinely don't need an introduction. Anne Fraser, as all of you know, was founding Dean Murray Fraser's full partner in the creation of the school and remains the school's heart and soul. The law faculty's building is now named after both of them and is an educator and CBC radio commentator who has been hugely active in her various communities throughout her life, including Victoria, but also Halifax and Calgary, and of course in the broader Canadian community. And it's an immense pleasure and privilege to have you with us today. Anne?
Talk about an immense privilege and pleasure. It is that for me. What a pleasure it is to look around and see so many familiar faces, grown-up faces. Sometimes it's hard to remember who we all are. But I am honored, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to kind of look back at the start of this remarkable law school. And it is quite remarkable. There was a lot of enthusiasm in this community for a law school to be initiated at the University of Victoria, from the bar and from people within the university. And this university, as you know, had been going for quite a while, was an offshoot of McGill with the three Martlets. But finally, I think they passed a notion at the Senate around 1969, and then in 1973-74, they really started in earnest. And somehow or other, they heard about Murray Fraser, who lived in Halifax and was a happy professor at Dalhousie Law School. And I remember the first call was in November, and we happened to be in Ottawa, where Murray was doing some work in family law with the Law Reform Commission of Canada, as was Keith Jobson, who Murray later snared to come out here. And Murray finally phoned back and said, "Thank you, but no thanks." "Aw, gee," they said. Well, not exactly. Then after Christmas, I think that the psychology was there. After Christmas, they called again and said, "Well, would you come out and talk to us and give us your ideas of what a new law school should look like and be?" No. So we came out in January. And honestly, we didn't even know there were mountains. You couldn't see a thing. You know what horrible January days can be like. But Murray was quite seduced by the whole concept. So we went back to Ottawa and thought about it and finally decided, okay, he said, I'm going to do it. The chance to start a law school with an innovative program, not the tired old way that law schools have been doing things, And so he phoned them and said, okay. Well, then we had to tell our 3 little boys. We were skiing at Camp Fortune one Saturday. I remember it so well. Driving home in our big station wagon, and we said, what would you think of moving to Victoria? Where's that? Well, we said, it's not too far from Disneyland. Oh. Well, by then, all 3 boys were in tears in the back seat. This was the day when you didn't need a van to have 3 kids. And so we had to do a bit of a selling job. Anyway, Murray came out here the 1st of July that year. The boys and I went back home to Halifax and had a great summer. Then they billeted Murray in the women's residence here. And I don't know if that has something to do with the reason he's been so good at fostering women's participation in universities. Maybe that helped, but I think I helped too, quite a bit. Anyway, we came out that fall, moved to Victoria, found a house, moved in. The house had to have a place for a basketball net and to play hockey in the driveway, so I found that. Little did I know how many houses I'd go searching for with various faculty members, and that was part of the fun, really. Thankfully, Jeremy has mentioned all of the faculty members, which is something that I was going to do, so I won't do. But I remember Neil Gold and Frank Borowitz stayed with us for a couple of weeks in our playroom. Well, they must have been in the 2 bedrooms downstairs. I don't think they were in the playroom. But our boys came upstairs, having probably been watching hockey, and said, do you know what? They use hair dryers. So, you know, I have to say, Murray was never into a hairdryer. So that was kind of a shock, and it kind of showed that they were younger, I suppose. And Neil, does anyone remember Neil's hair? It was more of an afro, you might say. And I don't know why he needed a dryer. It might have to tame it a little bit, probably. So those were the days. And then, of course, as Dean Jeremy mentioned, Diana Priestley was the key. And there was a bit of seduction involved in that Bora Laskin wanted her to be the new librarian at the Supreme Court of Canada. You remember all this. And she had, one point in her life, she came from Victoria. So really that was Murray's ace. And she decided she would come. She was also very experienced because she had started the law library at Osgood. And so she'd built a fine collection there, and so she was well practiced. But I recall Murray coming home at noon one day and saying, such a kick out of Diana. There she was in her white lab coat, do you remember that? And she said, some old friends have arrived. And these were the books, the first crates of books. And she was thoroughly delighted. And as you know, Diana and her staff built a wonderful library. And I do recall Donovan coming and checking over the library and saying, whew, I'm impressed. So that was a really good thing, and that was part of how we lured Donovan and Marilla to Victoria. And I think it was also Murray's persuasive powers and the opportunity for all of these individual people who were dedicated to teaching law to come and start an innovative law school. They wanted to do something other than having boring classes. And so most of you will recall your first month of classes here at the University of Victoria. It was a completely different approach. And we also thought, of the 900 applicants for the first year, there were 72 students came, and 40% of those were women. That was a pretty good total at that time. And I trace it back to early days at Dalhousie when Murray joined the faculty there. There were 5 or 6 women in the law class. He thought, this is very peculiar. And he became chairman of the admissions committee, and he was a very young fellow. But he said, I would like to have the admissions forms with initials only and no pictures. Well, suddenly, there were 40 women in the law class. Now, isn't that a strange coincidence? Initials and no pictures. Suddenly, they had no idea whether they were girls or boys. So It was a very decisive move, and Minister Anne McClellan, who some of you may know or know of, was one of those girls who still remembers it to this day. She would have been there anyway, but she credits Murray with that kind of thing. So we also wanted it to be a very friendly law school, and so we had to find friendly professors, which is what happened. Look at them over here. And we wanted to start off with a barbecue. So how many people in this room can remember the barbecues at our house? Oh, thank you. The menu wasn't varied. It was, and you might remember Murray had a chef's hat. I found that at a restaurant supply place. So there he was, cooking. Didn't do that too often, but at the barbecue with smoke, just engulfed in smoke. I guess the hamburgers were okay, but it was very smoky. Our kids were sort of, all the faculty children were there, and they were scampering around and offering cold drinks and so on. I didn't realize until I heard from my son Scott. Oh, he said, yeah, Mom, I remember that. There was beer. It was Olympia. And he said, the guy from over the fence and I took a couple. I thought, what? And of course, today you wouldn't, in Calgary, we never served any alcohol to students. So it's a different kind of host responsibility. But anyway, I guess there was Olympia beer. Who would know? I don't drink it. But anyway, we started off with the barbecue, and that was always fun and a nice way to begin. And then it began in earnest the next day. And the whole concept was to have an overview of the law, and that it would be a people thing. Laws affect people. It's not like a Bible. And so there would be 15 students and 2 professors in each of the small seminar groups, and you'll remember those, I think. You learn to do write up cases, apparently, and I think Chuck Wills, who some of you will remember, did a thing on writing cases, which I thought was kind of perceptive, and I found it. I had a bunch of things from way back. The feeling at UVic was that the students were the center of the universe. We were not at UVic to be taught law. We were there to learn the law and learn about the law. UVic had a first-year curriculum specifically designed to encourage student participation. We had a faculty chosen, listen to this faculty, for their ability to teach. And we had a dean whose primary interest was ensuring that students were getting a first-class legal education. All of these added up to a feeling that the students came first. Yay. This academic tone was set by Dean Fraser, and for that we owe him a great deal. It was also set by the whole faculty. It was, it was a team effort. Murray would have been the first to say that. And as his stand-in, I would underline that fact. There was one other thing I thought in this. They had a roast at the Empress at the end of Murray's term as dean, which was really great fun. Legal process set the tone of our 3 years at law school. The course, which was always maligned by students and which is least maligned by graduates. Hear that? Saying, oh, God, what are they doing this for? Anyway, you all remember legal process and how you felt about it. But at the end, and you'd also spent 3 mornings at a law firm, which is not a bad idea. The practical side of law is so darn important. And sometimes law students graduate and feel they have no qualifications to go into a practice, no idea how to do it. I should have mentioned this in the barbecue. This is not an intellectual comment at all. It was a note from Hugh a couple of days ago, our youngest boy. I was thinking back on that time of barbecues and recall, in addition to the relentless lineups of law students to the Leabrook bathroom and other social host liability opportunity, Dad's sort of crazy practical jokes that he would pull, often with the custodian. Does anyone remember Don? Oh, yeah. Some kind of tormenting of Jim McPherson as an apple-cheeked, worn corduroy pant-wearing prof. He says, damned if I recall the details, but I remember it being quite elaborate, very funny, and not without potential consequences. Can't imagine a law dean getting away with that in this era. Anyway, and then he mentions touring the Begbie building, which we did every Sunday. We'd go over with our boys and the dog on a leash, pulling, barking, and Murray trying to exert mind control. It didn't work. So when you came out of that month, you could brief cases to some extent. At least you knew what it meant. And you were hopefully able to do some interviewing, negotiate, some negotiating skills, advise clients. Imagine advising clients for money. And everybody does develop into a wiser counsel, of course. Murray also was very keen, and all the faculty were, to involve students on committees. And that wasn't done very often. So that was a nice way to take students into the family of the law faculty. I think one of the things that was always there, and you saw some of it last night in the tradition of skit night, there was a lot of fun going on and lightness. You may remember Murray's wake-up ties. Now, he had a collection of lovely, lovely silk ties. He loved ties. I was always giving him ties. But on his last day in the law building, the students had Murray Fraser tie days. And the idea, how many people were there? Did you wear an ugly tie? The idea was to bring the worst looking tie you could find. So this is a picture, you may remember. I'm sorry, it's not very big, of Murray, and the ties look like so many colorful snakes. Anyway, he had some really nice ties. The idea was, he called them his wake-up ties. So he always took 8:30 classes, being a morning person, and then you could get on with your work after that. The work of the dean's office, which you guys are well acquainted with. So as soon as he went back to the office, the tie would come off, and a nice tie would go on. So honestly, he wasn't a person with horrible ties. It was just to help students wake up at 8:30 in the morning. There's so much more I could say, but there is a certain time limit here, and you can only sit so long, I know. But I wanted to mention the official opening of the law school was April 75. It was a day exactly like this, only a bit warmer. Some of you will remember it, I'm sure. Bor Alaskan came. He was at that time Chief Justice. He was a great friend and supporter of the law school. He was terrific. Sonny Nemetz, Chief Justice Nathan Nemetz. Sonny was at our house one evening for dinner, and he said, I think I'll stay and watch the news with you. Marilla, you'll remember this. And the news came on then at 10 o'clock. We'd watched a baseball game because he was a great baseball fan. Well, Sonny fell asleep sitting on our sofa with his back to the big window. We had about a 12-foot window in our living room. Our son Andrew came home. He recently had acquired his license, so in came the Honda. And he banged on the window as he was coming in the door to say, hi, Mom and Dad, I'm home, safe. My gosh, you should have seen Sonny Nemetz. He stood up so fast. He was so startled because he'd been having a little snooze while he watched the news. Anyway, the support that came from the judiciary, from the bar, people at a bar in Vancouver who would come over and give lectures and moral support and donations, it was remarkable. And it took a bit of work. But, recruiting faculty was work, and they came from 6 cities. So they had 3 meetings across the country, I remember the first year, and then everything else was done, how different it is today, with memos and teleconference. Today would be quite different. Anyway, look at the faculty that was assembled in the tradition of fine faculty. And I think the only other thing, I better stop, right? How close am I? The visions of a building began to dance in the heads. And money had to be raised, of course, and a fine architect had to be found. Somebody from the faculty needed to be chosen to chair the building committee. And all of you will probably remember that it was Lyman Robinson. Lyman did a terrific job. And I know Murray insisted on having the architect who was chosen visit 6 law schools with Lyman and some others, 6 law schools across North America, which had reputations as being the best. Well, that worked, and then he had to come and spend 1 week in the McPherson with its idiosyncrasies, which he became acquainted with, and you notice he didn't adapt them to the new building, fortunately. So David Hambleton was his name, and I think that he designed a timeless building. One of the things we were really anxious to have was a student lounge that was on the main floor and that would have egress to the outside. And I think you've done that, and it's wonderful to know that there's going to be some renovation done, and that will make it even better, I'm sure. We, as I said, used to visit the building on a weekly basis, and it was marvelous to see it grow. And I think the building works very well. I imagine most of you would agree. And the point of having the architect live with the law students for a week was that law students don't bounce from one building to another on the campus. They live there. So it was important for him to understand that it had to be a building that was comfortable. So I think that's probably all I need to say. Perhaps I might mention a couple of incidents that I do remember, and I know some of you will remember too. Excuse me. Lord Denning's visit. Anybody remember that? He was a very distinguished jurist. Do you remember what his wife wore? Some people would remember that. Ginny Cummings would know. His wife, Lord Denning, as you all know, was a very distinguished, I would say elderly. I don't know how old he was, but he seemed to me quite elderly that time. But anyway, but his wife was not. And she came up the steps, up those steps outside the McPherson, those awful steps, concrete and steel bars at the front. Anyway, up she came, and people said, "Oh, is that his wife?" It was his wife. And as she walked down the hall, and you remember the offices, of course, boring, all in a line, it was like a glockenspiel. Do you know what I mean? People were, oh. It was because she was wearing very slim-fitting black leather pants. And in that era, and Lord Denning's wife, I think they thought she'd be in hat and gloves or something. And no, sir, nothing like that. The other incident that I recall, and I know some of you will remember, in the McPherson building, was April Fool's Day. Murray's office was filled with balloons. Now, there was some question. How did they get into the law school? And I think that Don, the janitor, was involved in this, I'm sure. He was the one with the key. Anyway, Murray's office was filled with balloons. That was fairly harmless. Terry's office was filled with hay. Loose hay, not bales of hay that you could heave out. And there were 2 chickens. But the funny thing is, nobody knows who got them. The chickens went missing. And we think that probably Terry, the farm boy from Kansas, might have slipped the chickens home to Ripon Road, Norfolk, where he lived. The chickens were never seen again. And in Keith's office, they put bars because Keith had been working on a sentencing project with the Law Reform Commission. So those were some very funny incidents, harmless but fun. And I think it continued that early tradition of lightness and fun, and life cannot be taken too seriously all the time. So I thank you for the opportunity to speak to you and the pleasure of seeing you. And now I'm looking forward to hearing from these really remarkable other people. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. That was lovely. I don't know who established those time guidelines, but they should be fired. I'm going to listen to you forever. Our second speaker is Andrew Petter. I've already said much about him. Gold medalist in the class of 1981. He then did graduate work at Cambridge, practiced in Saskatchewan, taught at Osgoode Hall before returning to take up a faculty position in 1986, where he taught especially in the field of constitutional law. In 1991, he ran successfully for the NDP in Saanich South, and between then and his retirement from politics in 2001, he held just about every portfolio, I think, in the Harcourt and Clark governments. He then returned to the faculty, served as a highly influential dean from 2002 to 2008, and is now president and vice chancellor of Simon Fraser University. Andrew.
So now you know I can't hold a job. And I really came because I need a lawyer. It turns out the administrative culture at SFU is a little rougher than it is at UVic. So Jeremy asked me if I could reflect a little bit on the contribution of UVic Law to Canadian legal education. And there's lots that could be said about this, but I will try to stick within the time frame because I think the contribution of this law school has been truly extraordinary, and it started very much at the beginning. So I'm really glad that I have a chance to follow upon Anne, who has given you a wonderful account of those early times, which predated my arrival at the law school. I was in the 4th class, but certainly the culture was well established based on the work that was done by Murray and that amazing crew of professors early on. I guess the thing I think that was the key to UVic Law's success then and has been its key to success ever since was a conscious choice not to try to replicate the traditional law school environment. Not to be a second-rate or third-rate law school to other traditional schools, but to be the best law school of its kind. And to be a law school that reflected values that were unique to UVic, that took advantage of UVic's size and location, the culture of Murray and the faculty. And I think that really is the message of UVic Law throughout the years and the reason why it has contributed as much as I'm going to suggest it has and continues to do so today. My perception as a student coming in early was very much that difference and that focus being around pedagogy, around that learning culture, student-centered, fun, a real sense of commitment to students and an engagement between students and faculty. I mean, there was no barrier between students and faculty. We were all in it together, was the feeling, and it was the reality as well. And then being in a capital city, there was a focus on public law and the contribution of public law, which went beyond that of traditional law school curricula. There was a sense of looking at law in its broader social context, law as a social instrument. In legal process, in addition to all the things that Anne suggested that we did, and we did do, we also spent time just thinking about what is law? What's its purpose? Why is it important? What's our responsibility as lawyers? And I guess that was the other dimension that really struck me. There was a concern about one's individual responsibility to the law and to society that wasn't just about being a professional. It was, I think, as Murray called it, being a humane professional. And that concept of the humane professional, an interplay between the law and one's own sense of values and one's responsibility to make sure that law was being used positively and not simply to rely upon the law in and of itself, that I think informed those early days. And it was very much reflected in the curriculum and in the way that curriculum was carried out. Certainly legal process. I mean, what a wonderful thing. You come to a law school, and I taught subsequently at Osgoode, and I came back from Osgoode. In fact, I suspect I'm here because I do bring the perspective of a student, a professor, a dean, a has-dean. So I've seen it in various ways. But, you know, most law schools, you go into your contract class first day. You go into your torts class second day. You don't have a chance to think about what it is you're studying, or to get to know other students in a group environment, or to have a sense of camaraderie that can carry you through the law school experience. At UVic, we came together in small groups. with 2 faculty members, as Anne said, and we talked through law, and we talked why we were there, and we got to know each other. And I think lifelong friendships were made in many, many cases out of that legal process experience and out of the interplay of students throughout the faculty that built on that sense of collegiality between students and faculty and among students themselves. The sense of collaborative learning came out of that, the supportive environment that Anne spoke about, this commitment to experiential education, the idea that education isn't just what you do in the classroom, it's what's happening out there in society. And that, of course, was reflected in the Law Center. And the opportunity through the Law Center and through some of the placements in legal process to actually take and test ideas in a real life setting and to be challenged by it. The public law focus reflected in the first year by having a full constitutional course in the first year, which wasn't typical of other law schools to have a significant course, in fact, a very large credit component of the first year curriculum given over to constitutional law, and then the other innovative addition of LLP, a course that looked at legislation and viewed legislation as an important instrument. So many other law schools were focused so much on the common law and on criminal law that the notion of other legislation was somehow lost in the mix, but not at UVic Law from the beginning. And later, other developments, the public law term, the co-op term program, the co-op, only law school in Canada, certainly in the common law, I don't know about Quebec, that has a co-op program. And I think, Bill, you played a major role as dean in both those initiatives, in the public law term and in co-op, which, again, differentiated the law school in ways that I think are really important and gave rise to really a wonderfully rich and engaging learning environment. The skills that were cultivated and the unique teachable moments that occurred through that interplay of classroom learning, group learning, experiential learning was extraordinary. Sometimes it was a little too extraordinary. I remember I had the opportunity, we also had early on, I'm not sure if Jerry, you were responsible for this, or maybe Keith, but somehow along the way we got designated as a law school that had a summer police program. So law students could go down and become police officers for the summer, not just as a ride-along, but you actually got sworn in as a police officer. The only thing you weren't supposed to do was carry a gun or drive. And the carry the gun was pretty strict, the driving a little less so. And I'd signed up for legal process in the fall term, and I thought it'd be great in preparation for legal process to do a little experience with the police. And somehow, despite my diminutive nature, stature rather, my friendly nature, but my diminutive stature, I got chosen for this program. So I spent the summer riding along with the police, and I think it was in the last week of the ride along, before a week's break I had before going back to law school, I was with a police officer on the South Beat, which was considered the quiet beat. It was the one along Dallas Road. And he wanted to take a little snooze, so he asked me if I would drive, which I wasn't supposed to do, but I did. And there was a call on the radio about a break-in at Vic High. And I said, Harvey, break-in Vic High. I said, I was break-in at Vic High. I said, no, this sounds real. This sounds real. Oh, all right, drive over to Vic High. So we drove over to Vic High. And darned if this wasn't a real break-in. It wasn't one of those false alarms which seemed to come in. And we got out and we went in, and there were some kids there hauling out stereo equipment or whatever it was. And I chased them, and Harvey brought the car around, and we got 2 of them, and we booked them. And this was my only booking the whole summer, so I was really excited about this. And it was a great capper to the experience, and it was a fabulous time. I felt really effective as my police officer role, and I went off on my vacation, came back, and went into the Law Center for my Law Center term. You can see this coming, can't you? Remember ROTA? Remember ROTA? After the first few weeks, you got trained up, and then you had to do ROTA. And ROTA is you went out and you interviewed the clients coming in. Well, you'll never guess who my first client was. And you could see this poor kid, and he's looking at me. And remember, I'm not looking like a typical police officer, so he probably remembered me pretty well. And he's looking at me like, boy, I knew the system was fixed, but I had no idea. No idea it was fixed this badly. And that gave rise to a teachable moment with Glenn, and Eloise Spitzer was down there at the time, and we had to create a Chinese wall and all sorts of other things. What a great learning experience that was. Not necessarily typical, but it was how one found learning experiences at UVic Law, and how they were nurtured through the experience. The group learning and legal process continued through other programs like public law term, criminal law term, and other programs. Over time, those strengths remained, but I think there was added contribution to them and enrichment to them. Building on that base, the law school built its capacities in areas like legal research, legal history, legal theory, including feminist and critical theory, bringing in some just extraordinary scholars in those and other areas. Those are just examples. They're certainly not by any means purport to be wholly representative. The law school became even more interdisciplinary in its focus. Connected with other parts of the university and other parts of society. It developed strength in areas such as environmental law and Aboriginal law. And of course, that then gave rise to the Environmental Law Center. UVic grad, Chris Tollefson, came back as a professor and very much was the person who drove for the creation of a clinical program around environmental law, which has become a leading feature of UVic Law and a leading light of clinical programs across the country, along with the Law Center. An interdisciplinary graduate program. Jeremy and I have a few stars still to show, not this one, but some earlier ones to show for the creation of a program that, Jeremy, when you came, you were just determined and you were successful, would be, again, unique and distinctive, and would not just be another graduate program that would attract a few students who decided not to go somewhere else, but would be a program that students would come to because it was the best program of its kind. And the decision was made to make it interdisciplinary, to give it a focus in areas like Indigenous law, like environmental law, like public law, that would reflect strengths of the faculty and the culture of the faculty and the kind of learning environment that had been created. On the Aboriginal side, and this is when I became dean, I was fortunate that John Burroughs arrived the same year I did, and I thank my predecessor, Jamie Castles, for having made that decision. I didn't necessarily thank him at the time for agreeing to become the provost, which created an opening for someone as acting dean. And since I just come back from government and wasn't considered suitable for teaching, I took that on, and it was a wonderful role. I loved it. But with John there and Heather and others and the faculty being very supportive, there was a wonderful flourishing of initiatives around Aboriginal education, attracting Aboriginal students. I think even before I came back and you were there, the Aboriginal Cultural Awareness Camp had been established, which is a wonderful program, unlike any other law school, where first-year students go out and spend a long weekend in an Indigenous community, participate in a sweat lodge, learn about Indigenous culture. That learning experience in and of itself is extraordinary, and it was a student-led initiative initially, I believe. But you add to that the creation of John's professorship in Aboriginal Justice and Governance, which we spent a lot of time fundraising for. Funny how Jamie could create these things and then leave the fundraising to his successor. The indigenization of the curriculum, infusing Aboriginal perspectives into many courses of the curriculum and enriching them and opening people's eyes to the importance of Indigenous perspectives and the impact of law on Indigenous people. The Akitsarat Law School. Now this is something, I've got to tell a little story about this. I was Attorney General in 2000, and I was up at an Attorney General's meeting with Anne McClellan, actually. She was the Federal Attorney General in Nunavut. And Anne said, Andrew, you might want to come along. We're about to sign an MOU that, if all goes well, will give rise to a law school up here. And I said, a law school up here? Who'd be crazy enough to deliver a law school up here? She said, well, actually, it's Jamie Castles in UVic Law. I said, that's nuts. They're the farthest law school in the country from here. She said, yeah, go figure. So I said, well, thank God I don't have to have anything to do with that crazy initiative. So when John came, I think that's partly why Jamie brought you, and I returned, guess what? The first year of the Akitsarat program was about to be delivered, and what an incredible experience the creation and delivery of that law school was. And it was a collective experience of the entire faculty. Many people taught, and we didn't teach by distance education. We taught by going up to Nunavut. And we created an elders program, and we did things that no other law school would have thought of doing, including the idea of delivering this program. And what I'm most proud of is when we first started it, we were told we should have 50 students because the chances of more than 10% of them graduating was ambitious. I think we started with 15 and we graduated 12, 13? 11. 11. Heather was a big contributor too, as was Kim Hartwins. I could go on. Everybody was. Whether they were teaching in the program or helping cover off back home while others were teaching in the program. So we had, by Nunavut standards, an incredibly low attrition rate and just a wonderful, wonderful experience. If any of you had the opportunity to be at the Longhouse in Thunderbird Park, where the meeting of the Inuit and that of local First Nations, that was an extraordinary evening. Or be at the graduation ceremony, where the Governor General, Adrian Clarkson, was there, Madame Loretta Bay was there. The Law Deans of Canada decided to hold their meeting, their annual meeting there, because they thought this program was that significant. And in fact, many of their faculty have been drawn in to teach in that program. That speaks about a law school that is punching well beyond the weight of a traditional law school, let alone a small one perched on the west coast of Canada. And I guess what really gives me heart, what really gives me joy coming back here is to see that tradition not only being maintained, but being built upon and continued. I know, Jeremy, when you said you wanted to be dean, and your sanity was verified, you said you wanted to because you thought that this law school was making a contribution in ways that were different, and you wanted to continue that. And I know from talking to two faculty members who are leading your current curriculum review process that you're looking at curriculum, and they still seem to be speaking to each other, which speaks to something amazing going on. The idea that has been cooking for some time, and I hope does come to fruition on the Aboriginal front, of a dual degree program. The idea of a program that would allow students not only to get the traditional JD, or as I still call it, LLB, but also an Indigenous law degree and have experiences in Indigenous communities, I think is an amazing idea. And just as an idea, it's the kind of idea no other law school would come up with. If you can actually deliver it, it will be of amazing importance and significance, and I think it will make a huge contribution. And I want to say a little thing about that, because I remember when I was a student, I got really excited. Jack Woodward had come back to teach a course. Remember Jack Woodward? Jack Woodward was in the first class, and he got very involved in Native issues and Aboriginal issues, Native issues, so they're called at that time. And he came back to teach a course, I think this must have been going into my third year, called Native Law. And I thought, well, this is cool. I'll take a course on Native Law. I'll learn all about potlatch. I'll learn about customary traditions of the Aboriginal peoples. Well, of course, I was naive and misinformed, because when I went to the orientation session, what it turned out was Native law was really the law about Native people. It was European law about Native people. It was the Indian Act. It wasn't Native law at all. It was law that regulated Native people, Indigenous peoples. If you go to UVic Law now and you talk about Indigenous law, I think most people know what you're talking about. You're talking about the law of Indigenous peoples. And yes, you still study the Indian Act and the Constitution and other aspects of European and Canadian law that don't have an Indigenous tradition, that affect Indigenous peoples. Those are important too. But there is space in this curriculum, and hopefully space in the degree program for actually interrogating, exploring, appreciating Indigenous customary law and the kind of contribution that it can make in a way that was unthinkable 40 years ago. And I don't think it would be thought about as much as it is today in the way it is today if it weren't for UVic Law. So it's been an amazing journey for the law school. I really am very, very proud, as I think all of us are, to be associated with it. I guess I just want to say in closing one other thing, and that is that as much as the law school has made a contribution in terms of its impact on legal education and the contribution it's made in that regard, I think most of us in this room who graduated from the law school would affirm that perhaps the most important impact of the law school is the impact it's had on the life journeys of the students who've come through the law school. And each of us, I know, has our own story. I just know in my own case, I would never have gone to UVic Law if it hadn't have been for Murray. Murray Fraser, new dean, building a new law school. I'm a political science student. I say, gee, I'm thinking of going to law school. Any chance I can come by and talk? He said, absolutely. And gave me half an hour of his time. And based on that interview, I thought this is the place I really want to go. Extraordinary, talk about walking the walk in terms of commitment. I never would have thought about teaching as being fun and exciting if it weren't for the faculty at UVic Law. Frank Borowitz used to have something called the Krasnick Happy Minute. If you know Alan Krasnick, you'll know what that was about. There was a little bit of pranks and practical jokes that went on. I don't know the full details of that story, Anne, but I think the story is that Jim McPherson decided to go down, or was asked to go down and cover off the Law Center one Friday afternoon when it was always quiet, and look after things, knowing there'd be no controversy. And I think Murray got Don the janitor to phone down to the Law Center and said he just shot someone and dropped the gun, and what should he do? Have I got it right, Jerry? More or less right. And it was a teachable moment for Jim. And that's when he renewed his commitment to constitutional law. I wouldn't have thought of publishing an academic article if Neil Gold hadn't dragooned me into writing a paper as a third-year student and then somehow managed to persuade me that it was publishable. I would never have contemplated graduate studies if it weren't for Murray again. And a whole bunch of others, Hamar and Jim McPherson and others in this room who encouraged me in that regard. I certainly wouldn't have taken on the role of acting dean without the support of amazing colleagues like John Kilcoyne and Jerry and Cheryl and Maureen and many others who, as I say, I think they really didn't want me in the classroom, but for whatever reason said, you can do this. And without all of this, I would never have contemplated applying for the current job that I hold, and I know I wouldn't have gotten it if it hadn't been for all of that. And since Jamie isn't here, let me just say that I think it also prepared me uniquely for my current job, because I actually think that Simon Fraser University has more in common with UVic Law School than the rest of UVic does. In fact, Jeremy and I are cooking up a deal to bring it over, but only in the sense that UVic Law School was born out of a very radical set of ideas about legal education. It could be different. And Simon Fraser University has its own radical history as well that has kind of morphed over time into a commitment to engagement and engaged learning, not universally, but that's one of the reasons I applied there. That's been the tradition of UVic Law. UVic Law has been an exemplar of engaged learning. And I guess I sometimes kid Simon Fraser that its real logo or word mark should be what I'm about to say, but I actually think it applies more to UVic Law, and that is radical by tradition. This law school is radical by tradition. And by that I mean it's always prepared to try new things if they're going to make things better for students and better for society. And this law school has not let us down so far. It's been a huge contributor to legal education into this country. And like I'm sure most in this room, and together with all those in this room, I'm just so proud to have been associated with it and so glad to be here to share in the celebration of its 40th birthday.
Thanks, Andrew. Jamie, by the way, will have his chance for a rebuttal this evening. Andrew's got so much about this faculty that I find is really special. The Indigenous initiatives that he referred to are hugely exciting. And if you get a chance, buttonhole John Burroughs, buttonhole me, buttonhole Val Napoleon this evening. And it would just be fabulous to have the chance to talk with you about them. And I should also say that that graduate program, like everything at UVic Law, was very much a collective enterprise. It's just amazing how people pitch in. Michael McGonigal had a lot to do with its interdisciplinary character. Well, our third speaker is Ron Skolrood. Ron is a graduate of the class of 1986. He clerked at the Supreme Court of Canada for Justice McIntyre and did a master's at Cambridge before returning to practice civil and commercial litigation with Lawson Lundell in Vancouver. He's been very active in pro bono litigation. He's been a strong contributor to law reform in BC as board member of the BC Law Institute and serving as chair from 2007 to 2012. He's also been a valued sessional lecturer for us at UVic Law. In 2013, he was appointed to the Supreme Court of British Columbia. Justice Skolrood.
Thank you. Well, those are obviously very difficult acts to follow. One of the things that struck me in both Anne's comments and Andrew's comments was the fact that we didn't get together and chat about what we were going to speak about, but there are some obvious common themes that run through what they said and what I'm going to say, which probably means you're going to find much of what I'm about to say redundant. But anyway, let me begin by thanking Dean Weber for the invitation to speak this afternoon, and in particular to be included in a panel with Mrs. Fraser and President Petter, both of whom have contributed enormously to the law school and the success of the Faculty of Law. I also want to thank Aaron, who's hiding in the back there, and the organizing committee for putting on this weekend. What a fabulous opportunity to come back, reconnect with old friends, and reflect and celebrate the 40 years of this institution, who has played a very significant role in our lives and what's gotten us to this point. I really enjoyed being up at the law school yesterday and being back in the building, which, and no disrespect, and I still call Begbie High, as many of us do. Seeing people I hadn't seen for a long time. There's been a lot of changes in the law school over the years, but some things were remarkably similar. The hallways, the lounge, the faculty's startling lack of talent. It was all reassuringly familiar, I can tell you. I must say I find it difficult to believe that I started at UVic Law in 1983, so over 30 years ago, and in fact next year will mark my class's 30th anniversary of our graduation. There are a number of members of the class of 1986 here, and I want to acknowledge them. We had a fabulous class. We had a group of interesting, diverse, fun people, not unlike, I think, most of your classes. But what I'm going to say, unlike, I think, many classes, there are 5 people from the class of 1986 who are members of our court. Me, Madam Justice Jennifer Power, who is here with her daughter, who I understand is going to be joining the Faculty of Law in the fall. Mr. Justice Terry Schultes, the funniest MC of Skit Night, I think, ever. Master Carolyn Bauk, who was around the law school yesterday, and District Registrar Scott Neilson. So I just had to give out those kudos to the class of 1986. One of my earliest law school memories is the Dean's Barbecue. And by the time I arrived, I think it had migrated to the back patio at the Begbie building. I was there, fresh out of undergrad, keen, enthusiastic. And I remember meeting this young guy. Seemed about my age, maybe a little older, wearing faded jeans and a corduroy jacket, kind of scraggly hair, sucking on a beer. Seemed like a good guy, maybe a bit of a poser with the whole corduroy jacket thing, but it was the 80s, so So you can imagine my surprise when 2 weeks later, when we finished legal process, and by the way, I loved legal process. I thought it was a great course. I showed up at my contracts class, and there he is teaching the course. And now he's the president of the university. Who'd have thunk? It just shows that if you come out of UVic Law, anything can happen. And indeed, I think it's and you touched on this, I don't think it's a coincidence that the presidents of 2 of our major academic institutions have deep roots in the Faculty of Law. As I mentioned, we had a great class, and one of the things that I've taken away is I made lifelong friends from that class. And again, not unlike I think many of you here. In fact, in my year, every May long weekend, since I graduated in 1986, a group of us get together. And in the 30 years that that's happened, I think I've missed 3 weekends. Twice when I was out of the province, and once when we were having a baby on the day after the long weekend. In fact, we had 2 older children at the time. When we go to Merritt, which is where these friends live, and our older children were so disappointed that we weren't going to Merritt. And it was like, well, you know, we're about to have a baby. And my son went on the internet and found that there was a really good veterinary clinic in Merritt. And he said to my wife, it'll be okay. But she put the kibosh on that trip. But I can tell you, when we get together on those weekends, and it's a very interesting group, reflective of our class, much of our time is spent talking about the good old days at UVic. You'll be happy to know, and I think I'm pleased, and you will be too, that most of what we talk about can't be repeated here, so I won't go there. The last thing I need is Tony Wilson writing about me in the Globe and Mail. Thanks, Tony. I don't think our experience was unusual, though. Over the many years since I graduated, whenever I talk to UVic students or graduates, I hear a common theme, and it's about the relationships that were forged at UVic. And I think it is one of the defining features of the law school that by and large it's been able to cultivate a culture in which the students support one another and revel in each other's successes. And Dean Weber talked about this yesterday in his remarks at the reception. I think UVic is known for the community that it's developed, and I think all of us have benefited from that. And I think that obviously made the law school perhaps a more pleasant place to attend than some of the other law schools, but I think it goes well beyond that. You know, throughout the time that I practiced law, I probably met and interviewed hundreds of students for articling positions and associate positions. In fact, my former law firm had a real affinity for UVic grads, and the reason for that was that in addition to the academic credentials, these were people that you could have a conversation with. They were people you wanted to go out and have a beer with. And more importantly, they were people you could put in a room with a client and they wouldn't embarrass you because they were real people. And I could tell you that wasn't always the case for some of the graduates from some of the other law schools across the country. I think that the practice of law really is all about relationships, whether it's the relationship between the lawyer and the client, between lawyers on different sides of a file, or between lawyers and the court. For whatever reason, UVic students have always seemed to grasp that. And that's why they generally do so well once they leave the law school. And I would add that in my current role, we see, and Madam Justice Power can attest to this, the diversity of the cases that come before us. And more to the point, the diversity of the people who are in the courts and the diversity of the stories that they bring to the courts. And I think it's the lawyers who understand the human dynamic in addition to the legal principles that do really well. And those are the people that, in my view, UVic has always graduated. And I think it reflects the conscious choice that Mrs. Fraser talked about, that it's not just book learning. It's about taking the law into the real world and using it to solve problems. That's really what the practice of law is all about. I think another skill or quality that UVic has always imparted to its students is the ability to be flexible and adaptable. I remember a time, and I think it was maybe when Jamie was dean, and Andrew, you may remember this as well, there was a bit of a standoff between the Law Society and the law school about the concept of mandatory courses. And in fact, the Law Society wanted to dictate, not just to UVic, but to all of the law schools, what courses graduates should take. And it was a reflection, I think, from pressure from the bar that there was a concern that people were coming out of law school without enough practical experience and without a grounding in the black letter law courses. The law schools pushed back, saying that they weren't necessarily in the business of graduating lawyers, but what they were in the business of doing was training or of producing well-rounded, legally trained people. And I, frankly, at that time, even though I practiced downtown, was firmly on the side of the law school, but I think I was in the minority. But I think history has shown and will continue to show that the key to succeeding in a law practice or any other field in which a legal education is applied is a well-rounded, broadly based legal education, and that over-specialization too soon is a dangerous thing. I can tell you that during my practice career, I probably reinvented myself 10 times. the cases I did, the issues I faced when I graduated in the 1980s, frankly, don't exist anymore. The things that the kids in law school today are going to have to deal with in their career are things that we can't imagine. You look at what technology has done to the practice of law and to society in general. And you add to the fact that the practice of law itself is changing, how we do the work, how the work is paid for, where the work is done. It's a profession that's in flux, and the way to succeed is to be able to change along with it. It's like the debate that many of you are no doubt familiar with about what's the value of an undergraduate degree these days. So many people would say, send your kids out to get a trade rather than going to what might be considered a general, unfocused undergraduate degree. And I'm sure Andrew has strong feelings about this, as I'm sure Jamie does. One of the best perspectives that I read on that was an op-ed piece written by Professor Gupta, the president of UBC, that was in the Vancouver Sun last fall. And he made the point that you can't predict what jobs are going to be in demand 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years down the road. But what you can say with some certainty is that what employers will always look for are people who can think, analyze, write, communicate. That's what an undergraduate arts degree gives you. And I say the same thing applies to legal education. You don't know what the landscape is going to be 5, 10, 15 years from now. But again, what I think you can say with some certainty is that there will always be opportunities for legally trained people who are adaptable, who can think and analyze, and who can communicate, and who bring some real-world common sense to legal problems. And those are the people, in my view, that, again, UVic has always graduated and done so consciously. And so I think it's a great testament to the law school for that. Now, that's not to say that law schools shouldn't provide practical experience or focus on the practicalities. In fact, again, I think Dean Weber talked about this. UVic's always been at the forefront of teaching the practical through its various clinical programs. But it strikes a great balance. It strikes that balance between the practical and the academic. And I think UVic does a great job. The legal profession is, and I can say this now because I'm no longer a lawyer, the legal profession is sometimes prone to self-aggrandizement, thinking that perhaps we are more important than we are. But despite that, I firmly believe that lawyers play an essential role in society. We've all witnessed in our recent times the role that law can play in promoting or perhaps facilitating change in society. If you think about Aboriginal rights, abortion rights, same-sex marriage, or most recently, the right to die with dignity through the assistance of a physician, all of those are significant societal changes in which the courts played a central role. And you can debate whether or not you think the courts should play that role, but my point is that these cases happen because they're advanced by lawyers who are committed, thoughtful, and bring all of those skills to bear. And again, those are the people I think UVic has always successfully produced. I made that point to a group of new lawyers when I had the opportunity to speak at a call ceremony in Vancouver last year. But I also made the point that for every groundbreaking case and for every billion-dollar deal, the real nuts and bolts of the practice of law is in the day-to-day problems of real-world people. It's the sale of the family home, succession in the family business, who gets the kids on divorce, and probably most importantly, is this person going to jail? That's what the practice of law is really about. And it may seem trite and frankly somewhat corny coming from someone who practiced in an ivory tower or glass tower for 25 years, but it's the lawyers who handle those cases who I think really make a difference in society. And it's those lawyers, again, that I think the faculty has produced. And I really hope and I expect that going forward, UVic will continue to produce young lawyers who embrace both that challenge, but also what I consider that privilege to help out people in society. So that's what I have to say. Thank you, Jeremy.
very much, Justice Skolrood. Those themes, each of those themes that you mentioned that have been so much a part of UVic Law since the very beginning still remain at the center of the school and at the center of the reflections. As you may have, those of you who were able to join us last night will have seen, we're engaged in quite a process now of curricular reflection and reform, and they revolve around exactly those themes. So thank you very much for those reflections. I should just say one more before we switch over, one more thing, and that is just to make very clear, thank you, Ron, for thanking Erin for her huge contribution. And the person who was responsible for the time guidelines was me, not Erin. Anyway, thank you very much. Thanks. Well, let's switch over to the panel, and then, but you'll have an opportunity to engage with Anne, with Andrew, and with Ron in just a few minutes. But if the members of the panel come up. Well, let me introduce the people that you see before you, although again, I think most of them will be very familiar to you. This fellow is Bill Neilson. He joined the faculty in 1977. He was dean from 1985 to 1990, expert across a range of areas of commercial law and regulatory regimes, especially consumer law, consumer protection law, and especially a huge contribution. LLP, there you go. And a huge contribution in his latter years to our engagement with Asia, which has been just amazing, and which we're still. We tend to think of our faculty as being a very local faculty. What is amazing is the extent of the engagement internationally. It really is quite remarkable, while still remaining intensely engaged locally. The next person off to my right is Hamar Foster, joined the faculty in 1978. He had the cheapest moving expense claim of any recruit to the UVic Law because he just needed fuel for his boat. He brought his boat from Vancouver over to Victoria and lived on it for 5 years.
Oh, wow. $30 worth of gas.
I'm trying to reproduce that with our recent hires. Of course, huge legal historian. And you should watch for his book on Arthur Eugene O'Mara, which I have on good authority. He's going to be finishing up very shortly.
2016.
And then next, Valerie Pawson, who graduated from UVic Law in 1989, who clerked at the BC Supreme Court, who then pursued a career in solicitor's practice, wills, estates, and trusts. And in fact, over the course of her career, she has, like many of her graduates, worked in varied contexts. She practiced for many years with Fraser Milner Casgrain. She served with Royal Trust, where she was a department manager and trust officer, and she now has her own boutique firm in West Vancouver, Pawson Law. And has also been very active, as so many UVic graduates have been, beyond her practice, in continuing legal education and in philanthropy. She's also one of UVic Law's dynasties. Now, with her with Owen Pawson, as well as Valerie being graduates of the faculty, and their daughter Natalie, now being a student of ours. There are other, of course, famous dynasties, the Crabtrees, 5 members, including Chief Judge Thomas Crabtree, and Rob Lapper and his family. In fact, Rob sends his greetings. He very much would have wanted to be here, but he had responsibilities as the CEO of the Law Society of Upper Canada that prevented him from coming. Yes, thanks, Valerie. Then Barry Penner, who graduated in the class of 1992, ran for office and was elected in 1996, and served as MLA for Chilliwack and its successor ridings until 2012, when he retired in order to take up retired from the legislature, to take up a position with Davis LLP, and you will know him as cabinet minister in the Campbell government in several successive portfolios, including environment and Aboriginal peoples. He, in fact, most recently went to Myanmar last year in order to take up a position with Myanmar Legal Services. Myanmar used to be called Burma, in fact, still is called Burma by many. And with the birth of their second child, however, returned to BC, where he now serves as a consultant. So wonderful you could join us. And Mila Shah, who's the most recent graduate among these, graduated in 2012, with the Law Society of BC Gold Medal and a huge stack of prizes, which I won't take time to list. She clerked first for the BC Court of Appeal and then at the Supreme Court of Canada for Chief Justice McLaughlin. And I have inside information that she was a fabulous clerk. And she now practices with Peck and Company, criminal law in Vancouver. So wonderful you could join us, Mila. And what we'll do is we'll just kind of have some questions that engage the members of the panel and then open up for questions from everyone. I thought I'd start with you, Hamar.
I'm trained to speak in 50-minute blocks.
Restrain yourself, please. 50-second blocks will do. Yeah. We've had discussions about how fabulous UVic Law was in the first years and how much support there was for UVic Law in the first years, but it wasn't universal support, was it? And I wonder if you could tell some of the, because that the first vote to establish the law school happened several years before it was actually possible to establish it.
It did. It's interesting to compare it with Thompson Rivers Law School, which, at least to my appearances, everyone woke up in the Law Society and the law schools one morning and found there was a new law school in Kamloops affiliated with Calgary. It took about 10 years to establish UVic. And I divided into two phases. The one I would call the Ron Cheffins phase, and the second I'll call the NDP phase. And I went back and looked at some of Marilla Waters' oral history interviews with Ron and Murray, just to refresh my memory about this. And it's really quite striking how the perception in the legal world in Canada in the mid to late 60s was that this man called Ron Cheffins had left Montreal to cross the mountains and establish a law school. And it turns out that he was a friend of the president of the University of Calgary, because he decided the other law schools were all too moribund to possibly do what he wanted to do. He was very unhappy with his education at UBC. And he'd written an article in McGill Law Journal in 1964 called Legal Education at McGill. And if you look at that article, it's striking to see how many of the themes that we're talking about today are in that article. And then the president of Calgary became the first president, I think, of the University of Victoria. And so he managed to get Ron appointed at the political science department. And I don't want to go on too long about this, but it's interesting, because according to Ron, on the day he arrived, he had a carbon copy letter from the new president of UVic, basically saying that he'd been contacted by the Law Society, who had been contacted by UBC Law, that said they were adamantly opposed to any new second law school in BC. So it then took about from 66 to 69 to finally get the Senate, I think, of UVic to approve it in principle. It then sort of went on the back burner until the NDP government came in 72, and Alex MacDonald, the Attorney General, stood up in the legislature. And Bill probably has something to say about this, because it seems to me that you and Jim Matkin and a few others were in the background there when this was going on.
I don't know anything about it.
Takes the fifth, clearly. And that's when it really accelerated, and the schools, as you've heard from Anne and others, got going in 74, 75. But the first newspaper articles about the proposal appear in 66. So that's, 8 or 9 years it took compared to what appeared to be overnight for Thompson Rivers. Yeah.
But one of the things that's always amazed me about UVic, having seen other new law schools in Australia where there have been plenty of new law schools, is how quickly it managed to establish itself as being a very serious law school with a very big contribution to make. And I wonder, Bill, you came in 2 years after it was founded, and what were your impressions as you came, and what was your sense of it?
I had a very simple calculus. I didn't want to go back to Osgood. I was on leave from Osgood, and I had some good years there. Very demanding place. Not a very collegial place at the time. I think they've improved over the years, but I always thought their faculty seminars were sort of bait and switch sessions. They would bait somebody on faculty to give something, then they would switch and become absolute enemies and eviscerate them, and then it was over. And then you'd all go back and teach. So it was nice to be under the gun, but not 24/7. But the UVic experience that I was so happy to join, I remember phoning up Murray and saying, because he had been in touch with me. And Ron Cheffins, I knew at McGill. And in fact, we met in Toronto and used to go to soccer games. Ron was a very good soccer player, but usually close to his goalie. He was very good. He never roamed more than 20 feet. He was sort of a second goalie, and that's why he could play into his 60s, because he was never tired. But I remember standing at the old varsity stadium at U of T, and we were talking about this, and he says, well, I'm going to Victoria. I said, really? What for? I'm going to join poli-sci. I said, well, that's okay. That's very nice. But what happened to law? Well, they don't have a law school, but maybe one day they'll have one. And sure enough, later on, there was a law school. And Murray became the first dean, and the rest is history. And I joined in January '77. Just one quick story. This is a very, I don't have to tell Andrew and others, this is a sickly, divisive province when it comes to politics. Oh, really? Sickly. It's slightly better than it used to be, but only slightly. So here I was, 3 years leave of absence from Osgood with all these law profs. There were 4 or 5 of us at one time, all brought up from the East by Dave Barrett. None of them rabid socialists or anything like that. Terry Eisen maybe being the one exception, but he came from Queens. I came from Osgood. He came from Queens, and I came from Osgood, as did Paul Weiler, for example, and John Hogarth to head up the police commission. So I was in Australia when I got the call, having led a workshop here before I took off on my sabbatical to Australia. Still on leave. Got a call. My wife says, you're supposed to get hold of Victoria. Well, this is 1973. Well, you just don't phone up Victoria in 1973. I said, oh, God, how do I get hold of them? So it was Alex McDonald. And he said, well, could you come and chair the Law Reform Commission? I said, no, I'm not doing that. I don't want to spend my time writing those reports. Thanks very much. Then the next day I got a call from an MLA, Phyllis Young, who wasn't, she was minister without portfolio. And she said, okay, it's time for you to walk the walk now. You do a lot of talking. You've drafted all this legislation. Come and head up the new Department of Consumer Services. And I did that for 3 years. The last one with the Socrates, where ironically I ended up closer with Bill Bennett than I ever did with Dave Barrett, because he wanted somebody to advise him on federal-provincial relations. And so after 3 years, I had to write 2 press releases to leave government service. One was for the government / press gallery, and the other one was for UVic. And so I had to have this common theme, but separately written, of this seamless transition, apolitical, from public service to professor, going back to what I was. But you know what? It didn't matter. For years afterwards, and there's nothing new with it. Oh, you worked with Barrett, did you? Well, what do you teach in LLP? Do you teach you? And it went on and on and on and on. I think, now that I've retired, I feel very free from all this. Because it was very, very challenging at that time, very upsetting. You just wanted to be accepted for who you were. But the labels in this province run a long way. What was your question?
I think you would answer it. One of the things that has always amazed me about the faculty as well is it tends to think of itself, and rightly so, as being really strong in constitutional law and public law and government regulation. But it also has a distinguished history in private law and in the interface, especially the interface between the regulatory state and private relations, which your work, Bill, certainly focused on. Of course, with the contributions of Donovan Waters in the law of trusts that is being carried on within the faculty. It's terrific. And Valerie, you ended up pursuing a solicitor's practice in an area that really did draw upon, is in the area of wills, estates, and trusts. And I wonder how you saw UVic Law and how it prepared you for that, what some people might think kind of atypical practice for someone coming out of UVic?
Oh, I didn't think of it as atypical. I was always going to be a solicitor. There was never any question about that. And I was always going to be in some kind of a firm in Vancouver. I didn't really have any public policy or interest in that area. It just wasn't what I wanted. But I did have the privilege of having Professor Waters as my professor. And so when I went to, when I had the privilege of clerking, I had 2 wills variation cases coming for the judges that I was working on, which were very interesting. And when I went to article at what's now Faskin's, I said there was 26 students that year, so I was able to sort of worm my way in and say, Jesse, when you give out the work, I'm really interested in the stuff that Professor Waters used to teach, and I got these 2 cases when I was clerking, so that's what I want to do. You just give me anything that comes through. So when I was clerking, or when I was articling, the students would trade work. So I would get all the wills, and then I would trade off my, which ones were they? We had to Supreme Court, not Supreme Court, but small claims court. So I'd trade off my small claims, and we'd have to do all these other little things. And so it was quite fun, and I really, it all built on Dr. Waters. It was great.
Yeah, well, it is incredible. We once had a solicitor's term, actually, I believe, that we haven't had for a very long time. In fact, that's one thing that I think is quite interesting about the school, is the practical engagement has often moved from a particular kind of intensive focus to another one. There was a solicitor's term. There was the public law term that I think you were involved in, Bill. There was the criminal law term that Jerry was very much involved in. Pretty amazing and revolutionary. Also the co-op program, which I think was established in the very last year, or finally was established in the last year of your time as dean. And it ended up being, the co-op ended up being pretty influential for you, didn't it, Barry?
Yeah, I'd have to say it was one of the better things that happened to me in my time in university overall. Just a shout out to Andrew. I'm a graduate from Simon Fraser, part of that ongoing alignment of interest between SFU and UVic Law. But yes, I remember getting a phone call one evening from somebody named Bill Neilson when I was a first-year law student, asking me, maybe it was, no, sorry, it was the start of my second year, asked me, how would you feel about going to Thailand? And I said, sure, where is it? I literally had no idea. I remember this is before the era of the internet and Google, so imagine this, I actually went to the law school library and asked for an atlas so I could see what I'd committed myself to, where this place was. But I spent almost 5 months in Bangkok, Thailand in the early 1990s at a law firm called Chandler & Tonge. And it was there that I met a number of other students from BC that were on an exchange program. And imagine this, about 2 years later I'm practicing in Chilliwack, and I get a call at my law office in Chilliwack from somebody who says, you don't know me, but I've heard about you from Myrna Bennett. You met her daughter in Bangkok, and I'm about to run for leader of the BC Liberal Party, and I need somebody to help me organize in Chilliwack, and that was Gordon Campbell. And so all roads lead through Bangkok, and if not for my co-op law term, I may never have received that phone call from Gordon Campbell asking if I could help in Chilliwack.
And then did that also lay the foundation for your time in Myanmar as well?
Yes, so I became friends with the founding partner of the law firm in Bangkok. When he heard that I left the legislature here in British Columbia in 2012, started sending me emails saying, you're sure you really want to work in Vancouver? Wouldn't you rather come to Southeast Asia? And with the opening up of Myanmar, to some extent, when the U.S. government dropped the majority of their sanctions, his little satellite office in what used to be called Rangoon, now Yangon, got very busy. So he asked me to come and help manage his Myanmar office, which was exciting for me, but challenging when my wife and I realized we were pregnant for the second time. And after the baby was born back here in Canada, we thought maybe it's best we put our Myanmar adventure on hold, at least for now. We love Southeast Asia, but just for family reasons, it's more practical to be here. Unfortunately, You know, a lot of my heart's still in Southeast Asia, but it's also here with family.
Right. And Mila, you ended up going into criminal law after a stint at two courts, at the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court of Canada. And what in the program inspired you to take the path that you've taken?
Well, I never thought that I would go into criminal law. I never saw myself doing that. But I took first year crim with Professor Ferguson, and I loved it. In second year, Professor Ferguson emailed me to be his research assistant, which I did for 2+ years. And I loved it. And I did lots of criminal law at both courts, for which I felt very prepared because I had such a good foundation. I took as many classes with Professor Ferguson as I could. And last year when I decided, hey, I want to do criminal law, I had a great mentor to call up and get some advice from, and someone who could call up some firms for me and put in a good word. So I think, you know, without UVic Law or, you know, such a great professor and such great classes, I would have never found my passion.
Yeah, good. It's great. Great to have you back in BC. I was wondering
it is
whether we were going
great
to
to
lose
be
you
back
to
in
Ontario for a while there. But,
No, definitely not. Not on days like this.
Yeah, how did you like Ottawa's winter?
No, I hate Ottawa's winter. Yeah.
yeah. The other thing that also amazed me over the course of the last 2 days, well, it's always been impressive, is the extent to which UVic has really set the law on Indigenous areas. And in fact, one thing I was quite struck by is looking back at the bios of you, Barry, and of you, Andrew. Both of you made big contributions to the Aboriginal Affairs portfolios. And I was wondering whether you could say a few words, Barry, about how you kind of found, whether that took root during the time you were at UVic, or whether that's something that really developed afterwards for you.
It was my first exposure, I guess, to concepts around Aboriginal law and the emerging developments in case law was at UVic, for sure. And I think UVic's rightly got a reputation for being at the forefront, including an effort to attract Aboriginal students. And so we have a number of students of Aboriginal descent in law school with me, and I found that to be very informative. I came from a community in Chilliwack where I had many friends growing up that were First Nations, but sadly, many of them did not manage to graduate from high school. And at the time, living in Chilliwack, I was always puzzled by that, but you didn't realize what was really happening in their own lives, just how difficult it is. And so being at UVic and then subsequently my time in public life gave me greater appreciation for the challenges that continue to this day to help First Nations people succeed in British Columbia. The challenges are still there.
And I should say about 8 or 9% of our students in the JD program are Indigenous. And in fact, Heather Raven, who's here today, was responsible for establishing a program of support for Indigenous students in 1992, in fact. I think it must have been one of the first in the country. Lots of schools were putting an emphasis on the admission of Indigenous students, but the kind of support and the kind of adaptation of the school that would make a real difference is something that not all schools did. And I think that's something that UVic really deserves to be very proud of. And Hamar, you were saying that Hamar has just recently served as expert witness in, well, a number of matters, but including the Silkwoteen matter, that was the Williams case that was decided by the Supreme Court of Canada recently. And you were saying that when you were being involved in the process of preparing for the case, everybody seemed to be a UVic grad, and a good 80% of them seemed to have taken your course.
Well, it didn't occur to me at the time, but I was asked to reflect a few weeks ago at a Gillian Calder's constitutional law class, and I started going through the people who both examined and cross-examined me and who'd done the oral history and who were organizing. It was quite astonishing how many of them were from UVic. It's not a conspiracy, folks, honestly. It just happened.
I have a story about admissions.
Oh, yeah? Please.
I used to fly to Asia a lot, and I would come back through Vancouver Airport exhausted after the 14-hour flight and cursing and cussing because there was always a line up. you'd get to the front, and there would be these newly uniformed. I made the grievous mistake of congratulating them on their new American uniforms. That was not a good idea. And so, because they're all garbed up now with all flash insignia and all hardware and so on, and it didn't used to be like that. So, where have you been? I've been to Vietnam or something. What are you doing? Well, I'm doing that, blah, blah, blah. Who employed you? Blah, blah, blah. I have been trying to get in that law school for 3 years. And I thought, well, let's see, I've got a few things in my luggage. But I can't make any promises. It was amazing. This went on for year after year. I think if for all I know, any border service personnel here, because they were all over those counters wanting to get into UVic. Maybe they said the same things to people. The other story has to do with Diana Priestley. I just have to tell this story. See, Diana was my librarian at UBC when I was a mere student. She was my librarian at Osgoode when I was a mere associate professor. She was everywhere. She was at Western. She was at Toronto. I couldn't avoid her. And the ultimate was when I was appointed dean. And she said within earshot to a colleague, you know, Bill has always been a nice boy. And I thought, oh, boy, am I in trouble? Because I got a call from an unnamed dean back east who said, what's this I hear about the name of your new law library? I said, yeah, it's the Priestley Library. Well, didn't you sell the naming rights? I said, this isn't Bay Street. I said, she deserves it. She's the leading law librarian of Canada. She is it. Well, did you get anything? I said, no, we're not a business school. I've always said the business schools sell naming rights to urinals. But I said, no, we're honoring her record of accomplishment across Canada and to UVic Law. Thank you and goodbye.
Well, and that is one thing, both the law building, named after Murray and Anne Fraser,
Yep.
and the law library, named after Diana Priestley. Yeah. Environmental law was another one of your portfolios, Barry. Is that too, do you think, came, but did that develop during your time at law school? You had some association with the parks before coming to law school.
Yeah, I was working as a park ranger in the summers to help pay for my tuition, which wasn't as high then as it is now. But I was fortunate to have a good summer job working as a park ranger. And I think really that's one of the reasons I wanted to go to law school. It was the questions I had when we're doing enforcement. Where do we get our authority to do certain things, or why can't we enforce certain rules out on the water? Why is that a federal jurisdiction, not provincial, for example? And I never got a satisfactory answer from my supervisors, because I guess they didn't really know. So I thought I'll go to the source and go study law. But I think it was Murray Rankin was teaching a course in environmental law at UVic when I was there, and I took the course. And it was just enough to kind of whet your appetite and further encourage my interest in the whole area of environmental regulation. So I ended up serving more than 5 years as environment minister in British Columbia. And I think there's no other province in Canada where environmental issues are more at the forefront than in BC. It was a unique opportunity to be under the microscope for a long period of time.
And Mila, what experience, like what extracurricular activities at UVic really meant something to you as you were going through just recently?
Well, I would definitely say Appeal, which is UVic's student-run journal. I don't know when it was established, so I don't know how long back it goes, but
Mid-80s,
95.
early 80s.
99, about 95?
Okay, it's completely student-run, and it's, but with lots of support from the faculty, and it's a great experience in research and writing and editing, which I think laid the foundation for 2 years of clerking, so. And then I was quite involved with the LSS as VP External, and UVic has a very strong law student society that is sort of the heart of the school, I think. So They run lots of student events, contribute a lot to the great student community at UVic. They run an amazing orientation, which you'll find out. The first 2 weeks of law school were so fun, and you have time to do the orientation because you're in legal process, not in class. There are barbecues, there are parties. There's the annual, I don't know how far back this goes, but there's an annual bar night where everyone dresses up as their initials. So, which is a really nice way to learn everyone's names. There's an annual trip to Tofino. There's the skit night. There's Slaughter Cup. There's law games. It's, the LSS is behind making UVic a really fun school to go to.
And you also mentioned when we spoke before, what happens after the first set of exams that students go through?
I don't know if I should say. It's a bit of a surprise. So
Oh, yes,
I'll-
put your hands over your ears.
Yeah, you can't listen to this, but the LSS does this really lovely thing for the first year students after their first set of exams, which is a very stressful, it's an extremely stressful time. Your first year law students, the year's hard, the first exams are 100%, and you've just studied for a couple weeks, and you come out of your first exam, and the LSS has organized a surprise finish line for you. So the LSS and many members of faculty will be there with signs encouraging you, an actual finish line for you to run through, champagne and cake. So I don't know how far back that goes, but that's my favorite memery from UVic.
Yes. Valerie, you didn't have the first class finish?
No, I'm
No?
sorry to say we
See
did
how
not
far
have
we've
that.
come.
Yes, that's great, yes. It was, yeah.
Were
It's,
there
I think, quintessential UVic, so.
Did you have that same sense of community when you went through in the 80s?
Yes, yeah. I was slightly different because I came as a mature student and I was married. We've been married for, I think, 8 years by the time we arrived here at law school. Owen a year ahead of me and me behind. So we were kind of in a different camp, and it didn't matter. It was still just very inclusive. We didn't do things that some of the younger kids did, like go party like crazy. But you were still, no, I mean, everybody did. When we were doing our undergrads years before, we were partying like crazy. But what was so lovely was that everybody was just open and friendly and inclusive. It's lovely. All the professors, everybody was just, you were all here on the same mission, which was just to do really well. Yeah. And it was great.
Thank you. Well, I think now it'd be a good idea, good time to open things up for comments from the audience, questions. And I might call Anne and Andrew and Ron up to the front again if you'd like. Come and take a seat. Yeah, come and take these seats. Ron Fraser, I saw, had a question. Or comment.
Interested in Andrew's juxtaposing tradition and radical as two words, which I thought were quite interesting, especially the conversations Jeremy and I have had about the things that are happening in the future. But I'd just be interested in one or two words from any of you that might reflect what are the traditions, and maybe one or two words that might reflect what is radical about maybe what UVic is doing, but also what is happening in the law these days.
Well, you've heard this before, I think. I think in terms of tradition, I came in 1978, and from the moment I arrived, the emphasis was on teaching and on students and on open door policy and on how sometimes that got a bit overwhelming, but it seemed to pay dividends. In terms of radical, well, that's a word that can mean all sorts of things. It means getting to the root of things, I suppose, originally. But I would list a lot of the things that others have listed in terms of radical. I mean, taking on the Inuit law program in the early 2000s. I mean, as Andrew indicated, if you hear about that, you think this is just crazy. Bill, really being instrumental with the co-op program. I think there's a lot of us who thought that co-op program, my God, we're going to run 12 months of the year. How are we going to do that? It's been a lot harder on staff than faculty, I must say. But it's been a fabulous success. And, you know, no one was willing to do it. And even after we've done it, and I think made it work, no one's done it. It's too much work.
I should say that Jerry Ferguson and I cooked up when we would present the co-op protocol information to faculty. It's like the Government of Canada and BC issuing press releases on Friday afternoon. We did it on a Friday afternoon. By dinner, we had a co-op program. And we thank April Katz and others for getting us there. We thank faculty. Took a lot of doubt to get over. The students had to be convinced on more than one occasion. Victor, who's taken over the law chair and is now a Cappy, and I had lunch the other day, and he was remarking, and I said, oh, that's an echo, I've heard that before. I remember dealing with students who said, I don't want to go overseas. Why? I want a job. Okay, if you're with a law firm in Vancouver, as an example, how many resumes are you getting in your law firm before they have the interviews? I don't know. Well, start with 200, and we'll go from there. So why do you think they only look at the cover letter for about 150 of them? I don't know. It's because they all look the same. So be different. Go overseas. Do something. Study comparative law. Learn about other legal systems. Take on a language. Do something. I wasn't trained as a nationist. If I could do it, you can do it. So try it. And it's a work in progress. I know that. Because law students, for all of their alleged radicalism, are very conservative. They do not take risks easily. So you have to convince them it's worth doing. If only because if you want to be truly conservative later on, you still need a job. And you're likely to get a job if you're less conservative when you apply. And maybe that's true.
I see Andrew eager to get in.
Well, I think of two attributes that are both traditional and still radical, I think, about this law school. And one is, you know, a lot of law schools, they think they have to choose and do choose between a strongly applied or experiential kind of approach to education and a deeply theoretical one. And this law school has shown that you can do both, and by doing both, you actually, I think, produce a much better educational experience. So the clinical programs, the co-op program with the strong emphasis on the experiential, combined with a very deep inquiry into legal theory and the introduction of feminist legal theory with scholars like Hester Lessard, and Aboriginal theory, and people interested in animals' rights. And that interplay is not common in most law schools. And the other thing that's been talked about, but I think is really important to emphasize, is the collaborative nature of learning and of teaching. When I came, I mean, I was at Osgoode for 2 years too. Mm-hmm. And when I came, and Bill was the dean, two of my first 3 teaching assignments were to teach in team teaching environments, legal process and public law term. At Osgoode, you could teach for an entire lifetime and never get to do team teaching. And the team environment, and I think we don't want to end this without saying this, all of us, I'm sure, wasn't limited to faculty and students. Staff at UVic Law School are unbelievable, and they were part of the team. And we sang last night a little bit about Rosemary and others, but the administrative staff, the admissions staff, how many times did I hear as dean that I came to UVic Law School because of Mila or Janet, or because those people actually treated me, even before I came, differently. So that culture was reflected throughout the law school, and the staff support, none of this would have happened without the kind of staff support that I got when I was a student, we all got when we were students, or as a faculty member, or as a dean. That is a truly radical idea, to have that kind of collaborative environment that includes staff, faculty, and students all learning and working together.
Other questions or comments? Yes?
I have a bit of a vested interest in this, but one thing you didn't mention when you were talking about legal process was the emphasis on research skills. I now call myself a research lawyer. I worked at medium-sized firms and bigger firms, and I dealt with a lot of young students and lawyers who come through. I worked for a while with the UBC legal research courses, and where their advanced course is what first-year students at UVic have had to do and always have had to do. And I have to tell you that most young lawyers who I've met who didn't have the benefit of coming to UVic and learning research skills, and I think everybody hated it. Nobody enjoyed doing it, except for Andrew, who was in the library 24 hours, I think, doing research.
I had Jerry and Frank, so they made it enjoyable.
I think that it's a huge benefit to be taught those research skills, and most of us don't realize it until we get out into the real world. Tony? So I think that's something, I mean, I taught for 2 years after my college of bar, I taught the legal research course at the school. So I think that's something that we should all remember and thank everybody for.
That's a really important point, and I think others who've been deans or faculty members and gone to alumni receptions, one of the most common refrains is, the thing I like least about law school was legal research and writing. The thing I benefited most from UVic Law School was legal research and writing.
I saw Valerie smiling, though. I think you may have actually liked the legal research.
I did. So, actually, if you don't mind me taking a moment, in answer to your question, one of the things that strikes me about UVic, I feel kind of choked up. Is that I actually never thought I'd be a lawyer, you know, and to be accepted was such an honor, and I'm so sorry, this is so foolish of me. Here I've been a lawyer for 25 years, and I still... was that it was one of the things that was so fabulous is that it wasn't just bright, perky, really young students that were coming through. It was like there was a lot of us. There was some Native people that I became very good friends with, and that when I was organizing the reunion, the 25-year reunion last year, I phoned one of my friends, Jack Williams, who's up in Nunavut, and we had a great long chat, you know. Other people that I'm in touch with who were mature students who felt the same as I did. What a privilege to come through, having done stupid things in your life and suddenly realize when you're in your 30s that, you know, I could actually probably do this. And then to have somebody believe in you and have you and accept you and come into such a rich environment. I loved every course. There wasn't one course that I wasn't, wow, I'm so happy to be here. So I think that's a really radical thing for UVic, you know, that they weren't just people like my daughter who were good at school when they were young and focused and good at university and then just went on to become lawyers. There was a lot of people there who were accepted, who had other experiences, and then it was so rich.
I had a couple of footnotes I wanted to add to a few things that came up, but I just wanted to start with Valerie's comments. And I've had students over the years, one of the things that they've said is much like Valerie, that for them individually, you know, they came to know more about themselves, they came to recognize they had values, and for many of those students, they felt very supported at UVic. I mean, we talk about student-based, but it's not just student-based in the classroom, it goes well beyond that. And for some students in particular who have more complex lives than some of the rest of us, and we don't always know that, those students, I think UVic's probably one of the greatest things, our greatest accomplishments is supporting some students who fall into that. And Valerie, you were very brave to say what you did, but I think it's, you know, it really is quite true. I'm going to leave the other more academic matters to my colleagues who have already done a great job talking about the early years. I was here from I guess I came, I was hired in the second year, but actually I started, so to speak, in January the first year because Murray would bring me out for the curriculum planning meetings. So I think I was at about 3 times, got to know the first year class quite well as a result of that. I think we were talking for a few minutes, Valerie actually and Mila were talking about the partying tradition and students participate differently. Well, I think a little footnote you all should be aware of is that you, I think, have the first year graduating class, our very first class at UVic, to thank for setting that as the tradition. As I recall, at their grad dinner at a place which no longer exists, it was called the Medieval Inn. We had such a party, including food fights. The wine was poured everywhere, including over people. We were banned, UVic Law School was banned from the Medieval Inn for life. And so that was thanks to Brian and Greg and many of the others in that first year class. The second story was about Murray that came out very briefly, and I won't give you the long details, but it was the one, the joking and pranks were part of the culture. And this one, of course, was already set up by Andrew, where he mentioned to you that Jim McPherson was sent down on a Friday afternoon to fill in at the Law Center. And Murray had this brilliant, he would later say, crazy idea to get the janitor to call and confess that he had just murdered someone. That almost, someone used the word dangerous. Well, why was that dangerous? You know, it was a bad joke on Jim, and so it was dangerous because Jim had called over another person. They were about 30 seconds away from getting on the line with the police. Because they were concerned that there were other safety issues. A murder had just occurred. Now, had that phone call been made to the police, Murray would have found himself in a position that I think he never did, which would be a somewhat degree of embarrassment as a result of what seemed like a great prank. So we're all a little lucky occasionally in terms of how some of these things turn out.
Listen, I'm sorry to say that I think I have to bring this to an end. We could keep going all night, but the good thing is we can, which is wonderful. Let me just say two things. There is a huge resource in the law library at UVic Law that consists of transcripts of interviews that Marilla Waters did with many of the people who we've been talking about over these days. And they are just absolutely superb. So come to the library and use that resource. It really is magnificent, Marilla. Thank you so much for doing that. And the last thing is just to say how wonderful this session has been. It's been thanks to each and every one of you for making the effort of coming and sharing your views, and I'm sure we'll continue to share into the evening. Who couldn't appreciate a faculty like this? It really is a privilege to be associated with it. So thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you.